They seated me at the back corner table, the one tucked behind the DJ booth, close enough to the kitchen that I could hear every clatter of plates and smell the garlic bread before it hit anyone else's table. I sat there in my navy blazer, the one I'd had since my retirement party 11 years ago, and I watched my daughter walk across the room in her white dress, laughing with people I didn't recognize. I'm 63 years old. I've worked 31 years at a paper mill in Sault Ste, raised 2 kids mostly on my own after their mother left when my daughter was 9 and my son was 12, and I've never once in my life asked anyone for anything I didn't earn. But sitting at that table watching the room fill up around me, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a boy, like I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. My daughter's name is Megan. She's 31 now. She met her husband, Bryce, 3 years ago at some corporate retreat in Banff, and within about 6 months of dating him, she started changing in small ways that I kept telling myself I was imagining. She started pronouncing certain words differently. She stopped calling me Dad and started calling me my father when she talked about me to others, like I was a reference rather than a person. She traded in her old Civic for a lease on something German and started saying things like, "We summer in Prince Edward County," as if summering was a verb that had always existed in her vocabulary. I tried not to let it bother me. That's what you do when you're a father. You swallow it. Bryce works in private equity. I don't fully understand what that means, and I'll be honest, he's never explained it to me in a way that suggested he wanted me to understand. What I do know is that his family is from West Vancouver. His mother has a hyphenated last name she introduces herself by in full at every occasion, and the first time I met him at Megan's apartment in Toronto, he shook my hand and looked slightly past my left ear the whole time, like there was something more interesting just behind me. The wedding was at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. Beautiful place. Rolling hills, September light, the kind of golden afternoon that makes Ontario look like somewhere people choose to come to, rather than somewhere they're just from. The venue cost. Well, Megan mentioned the number once and then never mentioned it again, like she regretted saying it out loud. Bryce's family covered most of it. I know that because it was made clear to me, gently but clearly, in a phone call with Megan about 3 months before the wedding, that my contribution to the day would be just showing up and enjoying yourself, Dad. She didn't mean it unkindly, I think, but the way she said it, the particular softness of it, like she was managing expectations, told me everything about what my role was supposed to be. I drove down from Sault Ste. The day before. 7 hours. My truck has 280,000 kilometers on it, and the passenger window doesn't roll all the way down. But it runs fine, and I know every noise it makes. I checked into the motel I'd found online, $38 cheaper a night than the inn where Bryce's family was staying, and I pressed my blazer with the iron I found in the closet, and I told myself tomorrow would be a good day. I arrived at the venue 40 minutes before the ceremony. Megan had texted me the morning schedule. I found the usher at the entrance, a young man in a rented tux who smiled the practiced smile of someone doing a job, and I told him I was the bride's father. He checked his clipboard. "Oh," he said, and something shifted in his expression. "Just one moment." He disappeared for about 2 minutes. When he came back, he led me through the main hall, past the long head table with the floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly pension payment, past the tables with the little laser-cut name cards and the favors in their craft paper bags, all the way to the far back end of the room. The table was near the secondary entrance, the one the catering staff used. There was a folding screen beside it, decorative, placed there presumably to separate the dining area from the service corridor. My name card was there. Just mine. The other seats at the table were for people I'd never heard of. Someone named the Hendersons +2, a work colleague of Bryce's with a +1. I stood there for a moment. An older woman from the venue staff walked past with a tray and caught my eye, and gave me a small, sympathetic smile that I wish she hadn't. That kind of pity from a stranger is the thing that stays with you. I sat down. I straightened my name card. I put my hands in my lap, and I looked across the room at the head table, and I thought about the drive down, about the iron in the motel closet, about the fact that I'd gotten my hair cut the week before by the same barber I'd gone to for 20 years because I wanted to look right for my daughter's wedding day. The ceremony was held outdoors on the lawn facing the vineyard. It was beautiful. I'll give it that. Megan looked. She looked the way you always imagine your kid will look on the day they get married. All that particular joy that belongs only to that particular moment. And for a few minutes I forgot about the table and just watched her. That's still there. That feeling. Whatever else is complicated, that part is simple. I wasn't in the processional. I found this out the week before, when Megan mentioned, in a way that suggested she thought she'd already told me, that Bryce's stepfather would be walking her down the aisle because it flows better with the wedding party arrangement. I said I understood. I went to my car afterward and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes. During the cocktail hour after the ceremony, I stood near the edge of things and had a glass of the Riesling they were pouring, which was very good, and I watched my daughter move through the crowd with the ease of someone completely at home. A few of Bryce's relatives introduced themselves to me. They were pleasant enough in the way that people are pleasant when they're performing pleasantness. His mother, Helena. She introduced herself as Helena Cartwright Webb, held my hand briefly after shaking it, and said, "Megan has told us so much about you," which is the kind of sentence people say when they've been told just enough to be polite. My son, Jamie, was there. He's 28, lives in Calgary, works in the trades, pipe fitter. He'd flown in and was staying at the motel with me. He found me near the rose bushes during cocktail hour and said quietly, "Dad, did you see where they put us?" I told him yes. He looked like he wanted to say more. I told him to leave it. "You shouldn't have to leave it," he said. "Not today," I said. "Let your sister have her day." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded, and that was that. When the reception dinner started, I found my table. The Hendersons turned out to be a very nice couple from Mississauga, friends of Bryce's family, who were friendly and talkative and didn't seem to notice or care where we were sitting. Bryce's colleague, a man in his late 30s named something I immediately forgot, spent most of dinner looking at his phone. I ate the salmon, which was excellent. I drank one more glass of wine. I watched the head table from across the room. I didn't want anyone to feel sorry for me. That was the thing I kept telling myself. I could feel it, the potential for pity, hanging around me at that table like weather, and the only thing worse than what had already happened would be someone noticing it and making it into a scene. So I sat straight. I made conversation with the Hendersons. I laughed when something was funny. I was, I think, very good at being fine. And then, about 40 minutes into dinner service, a man I didn't recognize came to my table and sat down in the empty seat beside me. He was maybe my age, possibly a few years older, with gray hair cut short and the kind of posture you develop either from the military or from decades of not letting yourself slouch. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit, not a tuxedo, just a well-made suit, and he had the look of someone who is very used to being in rooms full of people and finding them only mildly interesting. He set his wineglass down, adjusted his chair, looked at me directly and said, "You're the bride's father." It wasn't a question. "I am," I said. He nodded slowly like, this confirmed something. Then he said, "My nephew married your daughter. I'm her husband's great-uncle. I was supposed to be at the head table, but I've spent 40 years avoiding the head table at functions like this, and I'm not starting now." He picked up his wineglass. "I'm Warren." I told him my name. He shook my hand. His handshake was the kind you only get from someone who's shaken 1,000 hands, in situations where the handshake matters. We talked. Or rather, he asked questions and I answered them, and then somewhere along the way the conversation turned and I was asking questions too. He'd spent most of his career in resource development, mining mostly northern Ontario and parts of British Columbia, and had retired about 4 years ago to a place outside Huntsville. He asked about the mill. He knew what a paper mill was, knew the kind of work it required. asked specific questions about the maintenance side that told me he was genuinely curious and not just performing curiosity. About 20 minutes into this conversation, I saw my son Jamie across the room. He was standing near the bar, talking to someone, but his eyes found me and he looked startled. He wasn't looking at me exactly. He was looking at the man sitting next to me, and Jamie's expression was something I hadn't seen on his face in a long time. It wasn't alarm exactly. It was more like recalibration. Like he'd looked at a map and realized the road he thought he knew went somewhere different than he'd assumed. I didn't know what that meant yet. What I didn't know, what nobody had seen fit to tell me, which I'm still not entirely sure whether to be amused or annoyed about, was who Warren actually was. What I found out later that evening, when Jamie pulled me aside near the end of the night, was that Warren Ashby was not simply Bryce's great-uncle. He was, among other things, the founding partner of the investment firm where Bryce worked, the firm where Bryce had recently been put forward for a senior partnership position. A position, Jamie informed me, that required the endorsement of exactly one person above all others: Warren Ashby. I had spent an hour and a half sitting in the back corner of the room, next to the kitchen entrance, having a conversation with the man my son-in-law most needed to impress, and Bryce hadn't known. Hadn't thought to check, hadn't apparently considered that the man being seated quietly at the back of the room was worth paying attention to. I didn't know any of this during dinner. I just knew that I was having the first genuinely comfortable conversation I'd had all day, with a man who asked me real questions and listened to real answers, and that the food was good and the wine was good and the evening light was still coming through the windows in my particular September way. Warren had asked me, at some point during dinner, why I was sitting at the back. I was direct with him. I told him they'd seated me there. I didn't editorialize. I just told him the fact of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a particular kind of mistake." I said I supposed it was. He said, "The kind that tells you something." I didn't respond to that. There wasn't much to say. Near the end of the dinner, before the dancing started, Bryce came to the table. I'd seen him moving through the room with Megan, doing their rounds, and I watched him approach with that particular smile he puts on for people he's about to charm. And then he got close enough to see who was sitting beside me, and the smile changed, not dramatically, just the infrastructure of it shifted. Like a building that looks fine but you can hear something adjusting inside the walls. He greeted Warren with a warmth that was almost physical, clapping him on the shoulder, saying his name twice, explaining that he'd been looking for him all evening. Warren shook his hand and said he'd been right here and looked mildly amused. Then Bryce looked at me and then at Warren and then back at me, and I watched him understand in real time that we had been talking for the better part of the evening. He said, "I see you've met Megan's father," in a way that tried to sound casual. Warren said, "We've had a great conversation. You didn't tell me he spent 30 years in resource operations. We've been comparing notes on Northern Ontario for the last hour." Bryce laughed in the way people laugh when they're not sure what's funny. Warren stood up eventually, shook my hand again, and told me it had been a genuine pleasure. He gave me his card, a simple card, just his name and a phone number, and said I should reach out sometime if I ever made it down to Huntsville. Then he excused himself, said something to Bryce about connecting before the end of the night, and walked away with that steady, unhurried pace of someone who has nowhere to be and knows it. Bryce stood there for a moment after Warren left. I looked up at him from my chair at the back corner table. "He's a good man," I said. "Yes," Bryce said. He was looking at Warren's back across the room. "He is?" There was a pause. "I'm glad you had someone to talk to," Bryce said finally, and I could hear him trying to land on the right tone and not quite getting there. "I always find someone," I said. He looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time, and I think something registered. I don't know what he saw. An old man in a 20-year-old blazer who'd driven 7 hours and pressed his clothes with a motel iron and sat at the back of his daughter's wedding without a word of complaint. Or maybe he just saw someone who had spent an evening talking to the most important person in the room and hadn't even been trying to. Either way, he excused himself and went to find my daughter. The dancing started. I watched for a while and then Jamie found me, and we stood together near the edge of the floor and watched Megan dance with Bryce. And I told Jamie everything Warren and I had talked about. And Jamie shook his head slowly the whole time with an expression that was somewhere between amazement and something more complicated. He didn't know, Jamie said. Bryce. He genuinely didn't know who you were sitting with. I know, I said. How are you not angry about this? I thought about it. I'm 63, I said. I don't have enough time left to spend it being angry about things that didn't go the way I wanted. Jamie looked at me. That's either very wise or very sad. Probably both, I said. About an hour later, Megan found me. She'd had a few glasses of champagne, and her eyes were bright, and she hugged me in that fierce way she used to when she was small, both arms all the way around, no performance to it. She said, Daddy, I heard you and Warren talked all evening. I said we did. She pulled back and looked at me. He told Bryce you were the most interesting person he'd spoken to in years. I didn't say anything. He asked Bryce why you were seated so far from the family tables. I watched her face while she processed what that question meant. I saw her understand. Not everything. She didn't know yet about the partnership, about the endorsement, about any of the particular stakes, but she understood the basic geography of what had happened. She put her father at the back of the room, and the most important guest at her wedding had come to find him there. Dad, she started. It was a beautiful wedding, I said. You looked beautiful. That's what I'm going to remember. She looked like she might cry. She said, That's not all I want you to remember. I know, I said. We stood there for a moment, in the noise and light of the reception, and she held my hand the way she used to when she was 9 years old, and we were crossing a parking lot, and I let her. 2 weeks later, Megan called me. She called on a Sunday evening, which she hasn't done consistently since she moved to Toronto 8 years ago, and she talked for a long time. She talked about the wedding, about some of the choices that were made, about the seating, about how she'd let Bryce handle too many of the details and hadn't checked everything the way she should have. She didn't say it was his fault exactly, but she did not say it either. She asked if I'd be willing to come down for Thanksgiving, to their place in Toronto. She said she'd cook. She said she wanted me to bring Jamie if he could make it. I said yes. About a month after that, Jamie told me that Bryce's partnership had been delayed, not cancelled, just deferred, and that Warren Ashby had apparently communicated something to the board about needing more time to assess. I don't know the details, and I'm not going to speculate about the connection. Life isn't a movie. Things happen for 100 reasons. What I know is that Warren called me in October. He had my number because I'd given him my card, too. An old business card from the mill, the ones I'd had made when I was floor supervisor. The kind with the slightly faded print, because I'd had them sitting in a drawer for years. He said he was going to be in Sault Ste. The following month, visiting an old colleague, and he asked if I'd like to have dinner. I said I would. We ate at a place I know near the waterfront. Nothing fancy, good fish, reasonable wine, the kind of restaurant where you can hear yourself talk. We talked for 3 hours, about the North, about work, about getting older, about his wife who'd passed 4 years ago and my ex-wife who'd remarried and moved to Calgary and sent me a Christmas card every year with increasing awkwardness. At the end of the night, walking to our vehicles in the parking lot, he stopped and said, I want to tell you something. I waited. I've been to a lot of weddings, he said. I've sat at a lot of head tables. I left your daughter's reception that night thinking that the most dignified person in the room was the one they'd put in the corner. He paused. I thought you should know that. I didn't say anything for a moment. The October air was cold off the lake. I appreciate that, I said. He nodded. We shook hands. He drove away. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before starting it. 280,000 kilometers on the odometer. heat that takes about 4 minutes to get going properly. The same radio station I've listened to since I drove it off the lot. I thought about my daughter in her white dress, all that particular joy. I thought about sitting at the back of the room and not saying a word, and how the man who came to sit beside me had seen something in that silence that mattered. I'm 63 years old. I raised my kids, and I did my work, and I drove 7 hours to be in the room when my daughter got married. I sat where they put me, and I behaved with whatever grace I could manage. And I talked to a stranger who turned out to know a thing or two about working hard and being quiet about it. That's all I did. Sometimes that's enough. I keep coming back to something Warren said in that parking lot in October. He said I was the most dignified person in the room. And I've turned that over in my mind a dozen times since, not because it flattered me, but because of what it implies about how dignity actually works. I didn't do anything remarkable that day. I sat where they put me. I ate the salmon. I made conversation with strangers, and I didn't make a scene. What Warren saw wasn't a performance. It was just what I had left after I'd set down every other option. I could have complained. I could have pulled Megan aside and told her what her husband had done. I could have made the day about what had been done to me. I chose not to, not because I'm a saint, but because some part of me understood, in a way I couldn't have explained at the time, that the way you carry yourself in the moments that humiliate you is the only thing that's truly yours. That's what I'd call character, not the kind you announce, but the kind you find out you have when there's nothing left to hide behind. And here's what I've come to believe about the way that evening unfolded. It wasn't luck that Warren ended up at my table. He left the head table deliberately, the way a man does when he's spent enough years in rooms full of people performing for each other, and has lost his taste for it. He was looking for something real, and what he found, in the corner near the kitchen entrance, was a man who had no angle to play. I wasn't networking. I wasn't managing impressions. I was just a father who'd driven 7 hours to watch his daughter get married and was sitting where he'd been put. That simplicity, that's what he responded to. Bryce, for all his education and his career and his family's money, made the kind of mistake that smart people make when they start believing that status is fixed and visible. He looked at my truck, my blazer, my table assignment, and he made a calculation. What he didn't calculate was that the man he most needed to impress was sitting quietly with the person he'd written off. There's a logic to that, not a cruel one, not a cosmic punishment. Just the plain logic of how things tend to go when you confuse the surface of a person for their substance. The world has a way of correcting that error, eventually. What I want Jamie to take from all of this, what I'd want Megan to take, though she's finding her own way to it, is that the 3 things worth building in a life are harder to see than a title or a salary, but they last longer. There's knowing right from wrong and acting on it, even when no one's watching. There's thinking clearly and asking real questions instead of performing the answers you want people to hear. And there's the plain stubbornness to keep going with some grace when things don't go the way you worked for. I sat at the back of my daughter's wedding, and I didn't say a word about it. I don't regret that. What I got in return wasn't justice in any dramatic sense. It was just a conversation with a good man and a phone call 2 weeks later from my daughter and a dinner in October that lasted 3 hours. That's enough. At 63, I've learned that enough is actually quite a lot.